It took nearly 20 years, but the world is finally ready for Shadow the Hedgehog 2. Now, I have to admit, going into this game, I was really nervous. I'd already pre-ordered multiple versions of the game, the deluxe edition on Steam, the collector's edition from Limited Run Games, that really overpriced one. I'd talked in my previous video, and my only video, about how good I was feeling about this game. If it hadn't been at least decent, I would have been really disappointed, to say the least. I was pretty worried, but the day before early access began and the review embargoes finally lifted, we got this. And it felt like a fever dream. I mean, high reviews across the board, how often does that happen for us? And if you're a fan like me, I'm sure you know how good that felt. It was like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. We were actually going to get a great game. And the wait for the game to drop from that point was just agonizing. The journey to release as a whole was pretty crazy. We had so many questions. I mean, there were arguments over whether or not a port of Sonic Generations was even needed. I mean, it was already very available on Steam, whereas Sonic Unleashed is still stuck on the 360 and PS3, unless you have a crazy PC that can emulate them well. There were a lot of worries about the game's design, just from those early access previews, like when they first showed off Space Colony Arc, they were showing those very little snippets, and even someone like me, who tries to have a lot of faith, I got a little worried about the level design for this game, and I wasn't certain that it would be up to the standard of Sonic Generations, which it would be directly standing next to. But there was also a lot of excitement. I mean, just like the original Generations, we got to have those discussions all over again about which levels do we want to see, which games are going to show up. Maybe we'll see something from the games that came out after Generations, finally see some Frontiers content. It was really exciting to imagine what levels and what boss fights, what music would be in the game. Probably the weirdest thing to me about the lead up to release was that we knew there would be an open zone, but we knew nothing about it. We had maybe 3 or 4 screenshots and like 3 seconds of gameplay from it, but they would not show it. But they showed gameplay from every single level leading up to the game's release. So for some reason, that wasn't considered too much of a spoiler, but seeing the open world, that was too far, no sir. That was a really strange choice, but nevertheless, I got really excited leading up to the release of this game. I tried to keep my expectations in check after seeing all those good reviews, and after all, if I'm making a video, I need to form my own opinions separate from all those raving reviews, right? But fortunately enough, I'm not here to share some contrarian opinion or clairvoyant critique that nobody's seen through yet. I'm really just here to talk about how great this game is and how much fun I had with it. Coming right off of Sonic Frontiers, it is pretty interesting to see the series immediately returning to a more typical Sonic structure. In spite of having a little open zone, exploring it isn't required at all of the player to progress through the game. The open zone instead just houses the entrances to the levels and to the challenge acts, which progress as you beat the levels and get further in the game. The only reason to actually explore the open world is to find extra collectibles which are completely optional. That would be these treasure chests, which can come with either artwork, music, or little snippets of Shadow's history for you to read about. Also strewn about the open world are 80 nuts and bolts for you to collect and give to Orbot and Cubot. You only get a pretty small reward for doing this, but I would say it's worth doing just because exploring the open world is actually really fun and satisfying. I actually found all of them on my own just by running around and exploring because I was enjoying it so much, just seeing what I could do and running around the space. At first, I'd thought that maybe collecting enough bolts would give you access to the final boss, and it would be almost Breath of the Wild style, where if you can sequence break and find enough bolts, you can access that final boss early and skip some of the game, but it's just an extra collectible, so maybe next time. Overall, I was actually really impressed by this hub world. It's nothing crazy, and it's pretty small, honestly, but I think it builds off of what Frontier set up in a really enjoyable way. It's much more compact than Sonic Frontiers, with a lot less ways to skip over the platforming challenges. The more compact design leads to it feeling much more dense in content, and it just feels like around every corner, there's a fun and unique way to interact with the world in a way that's satisfying to get from place to place. Honestly, for hours after the game's over, you can have fun just finding new ways to get around it, the fastest ways to get around, messing around with the surfing ability. It's a really enjoyable place to just run around and play with the abilities. The hub world also does this really fun thing where leading up to the boss fight, there's always a mini platforming gauntlet to get you hyped up and excited for the upcoming boss. But if you hate exploring, all you really have to do to get to the end of the game is run 10 seconds to the level entrances, because from there, you can fast travel to any level or challenge. It's really the best of both worlds. Ideally, for me at least, I hope the next Sonic game has something of a mix between this game's open world design and Sonic Frontiers. Something a little bit wider and grander, but with the more compact and interesting design from this game would be an incredibly good open world. And as the game progresses, hopefully you get some new abilities just like in this game, because that's one of the best things. As the game progresses and you unlock new abilities, new parts of the world open up to you because now you can access them with the new ability. It leads to it feeling almost Metroidvania-like, giving you enhanced access to the world and faster ways to get through areas because you have new abilities to play around with. And those abilities, the Doom abilities, actually really surprised me. They feel like a really nice evolution of what the Wisps were. For all the Wisp abilities, you'd have to grab it from a capsule, come to a freeze to activate it, and then use it in the very gimmicky area. These all integrate directly into Shadow's moveset. Whenever you see a spot where you're going to need to use the Surf ability or the Morph ability, there's no stop and start. You're able to immediately interact with those sections and then come out of it just as smoothly. It means that these abilities are additions to Shadow's moveset, which add more fun and interesting ways to interact with every level, instead of being some momentary reprieve from the great action you're already using. These abilities are really what sets apart Shadow Generations from the other Sonic games. The closest comparison I could think of would be the upgrades from the adventure games, such as like the Bounce Bracelet, and there would be my biggest problem with these Doom abilities. They're way too contextual. As fun as it is to use Doom Surf or Doom Morph, they're only used in like one level each. Whereas in Sonic Adventure 2, you could get the Bounce Bracelet and then go to any level you want and find fun applications for it. In this game, you can only really use Doom Surf in water sections, which only really exist in Act 1 of Kingdom Valley and Act 2 of Sunset Heights. And then for Doom Morph, that's really only used on Chaos Island and in the hub world. Other than that, you don't get to play with these abilities, which is a shame because they're really fun when they're applied well. The only one of these abilities that I don't like is the Doom Spears. And it's not even that it's bad, it's that it's pointless. The only application it ever gets is when the game puts 5 switches in front of you and it wants you to hit all 5 at once. It happens like twice in the hub world, and it's just really never useful unless you're fighting one specific enemy which you need to hit with 5 Doom Spears to hurt. But in most cases, you can just get around that in other ways anyway, so it just doesn't feel meaningful at all. The next ability you get after this is the Doom Blast, which allows you to launch enemies far distances and then teleport to them. This is another ability that's way too restrictive on where you can use it, but I also do kind of understand, because even in the places that you can use it, it can be absolutely insane and crack the game in half. So even though it doesn't get too much application, I think where it is here, it's pretty fun to use. My favorite of these abilities would be Doom Surf. Even though it really does only get used in the hub world and in Kingdom Valley, I just think that it's really satisfying to control. The way that it lets you fluidly enter and exit water sections is really satisfying, and plus it brings back the tricks from Sonic Adventure 2 with these little trick ramps that are in the boss fight using it and in the level. I guess now thinking about it, it is mechanically kind of similar to a skateboarding section, which might be why I like it so much. The way that it's used in the hub world to really open up the space, let you use trick ramps to get around quickly and all that, it's just really satisfying to mess around with that ability. It's really enjoyable, and I hope something similar to it gets brought into future Sonic games. The Doom Morph is an ability that I've seen a lot of people have trouble with, and I'll give it to them, it's not explained super well in the game. I think it's pretty fun once you get used to it though. The way that you can launch with it using a boost and then a jump kind of feels like an old Sonic game using momentum to fling yourself far distances, and it can be really satisfying to find out the best paths to fling yourself around using it. It is a shame you never get to see its full potential because you only get it in the second to last level of the game, and then it's not in the last level, so it really never gets any use. It does get put to use in the 2 boss fights following you unlocking it though, so I guess it has some saving graces. But hey, I guess it is a really good sign when my biggest complaint about these abilities is that I don't get to use them more. And that's probably why the final ability, the Doom Wings, is everyone's favorite, including mine. And the Doom Wings are absolutely insane. They're so insane that a lot of the game's marketing revolved around them. Plus, your level times when using the Doom Wings are recorded separately from your times without them, because the devs are well aware of how busted they are. They effectively act as a stand-in for the Super Transformation in this game, since Sonic is obviously off with all the Chaos Emeralds. Just like a Super Form, it takes 50 rings to activate, drains your rings while in use, gives invincibility, a higher jump, flight, and automatically fills your boost gauge while in use. Flying with these does use the boost gauge, and you drop slightly as you fly, but the amount of level that you can skip with these is ludicrous. I guess since they are so broken, it's probably a good thing you don't unlock them until just before the last level. You do, however, get a taste of them right from the second level of the game, which then leaves you anxiously waiting to use them again for the entire journey. Going back to all the levels of the game with the Doom Wings unlocked is an incredibly fun experience, seeing the ways you can break them, fly over all the obstacles, and all the different places you could think about activating them, using them, how to best utilize the boost. It adds a whole other dimension to the gameplay, and it makes every level worth replaying if just for that. It's really a great mechanic. I do think that's why it's the best ability in the game, because unlike the other ones, you can use it whenever you want, wherever you want, in any level, to add a whole new layer of depth to the game that wasn't there before and creates new ways for you to interact with these levels. I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I genuinely think this is the best implementation of a Super Transformation into any 3D Sonic game. It feels appropriately very powerful while still requiring enough control and forethought to be extremely satisfying to pull it off well, and to experiment with new ways to fly around a level. Since it takes a second to activate it and requires rings, planning on where to use it, when to use it, and how you're going to find the rings in your route becomes a really fun game in of itself. Plus, if you're not into it, you can always just turn it off because the times are recorded separately. I really hope to not see this as a one-off mechanic. I know it probably won't be wings in the future, but I hope in another Sonic game, maybe they can implement this exact same idea, but just as a supersonic transformation, because it really is leagues above any other previous attempt at a supersonic transformation in a 3D game, especially compared to the joke that is supersonic in the original generations. The way that each of these Doom abilities can tie into the levels, at its best, creates a sense of flow that is incredibly unique to this game, and it really elevates it to a whole new level. In general, though, this game's levels just have a great flow to them. I think it might have the strongest level lineup of any Sonic game. There isn't a single zone here that I dislike, which I can't even say for the original generations, which is a fantastic game. Just like the original generations, it follows a formula of each zone having one level in 3D and one level in 2D, although thankfully the 3D levels are entirely 3D with no 2D sections. And these 2D levels are actually pretty great as well. Just like the original again, the 2D levels make incredibly great use of its third dimension, constantly switching the angles and pushing the player in and out of the 3D space. It actually utilizes its 2.5D perspective in unique and dynamic ways throughout each level, and every stage becomes way more fun for that. These really are probably the best 2D boost levels in the entire franchise. I mean, just before recording this video, I sat down for like an hour replaying Space Colony Arc Act 2 over and over again, just trying to get better times, which before this game, I couldn't ever imagine myself doing that. Every stage in the game, 2D and 3D, keeps itself interesting by constantly switching up what you're doing. Let's look at Kingdom Valley, for example. At the beginning of the level, you're in this outdoor section between the castle walls. It's wide open, there are lots of sky rails, enemies, and ropes to bounce on. Very quickly, this section transfers to a water section where you utilize Doom Surf. You duck and weave between obstacles, jump off of trick ramps to access quicker paths, and choose one of 3 paths toward the end to get you back to the main section of the level. After a stylish dismount from the Doom Surf, we enter a section about climbing a tower in a vertical spiral. This is very similar to sections just like the original game, so it's a nice callback. Once you finally reach the top of the tower you've been scaling, you can either enter the building to do a small battle section, or use the Doom Blast on an enemy just outside to go entirely around it, reaching a bald eagle taking you to the next Doom Surf section. After another small surfing section, with 2 possible exits, we reach an area that is almost entirely bottomless pits, being traversed exclusively using the wind rails that were introduced previously in the level. With a couple of back and forths between regular platforming and grinding on the wind, we reach an eco that takes us to a section that's identical to a very famous set piece from Sonic 06 where you run down the side of the castle. We then reach the final surfing section of the level, in which you can either take the bottom path to surf all the way to the end, use a trick ramp to reach the top path, or use a Doom Blast on an enemy to reach the top path even earlier. Closing out the level, we enter the Mach Speed section from Sonic's level in the original game. This whole stage is just filled with choices that you need to make to decide which path you're going to be on. Every rope in the stage that you bounce on can be stomped on to take you to a higher point in the level. There are many different paths on the surfing sections, depending on which you want to go left, right, or straight, which take you to different areas. There are multiple different enemies to Doom Blast on, which can take you to a bunch of different areas again, and there are huge skips you can do over all the castles if you're talented enough. What I'm trying to point out here is that this level is made up of a bunch of different sections which all ask different things of the player. At first, you're platforming through a ravine, then that ravine fills with water, and you're doing a surfing set piece. That set piece then transitions into climbing a tower. The tower then takes you all the way around the castle, grinding on air rails throughout it. There are a handful of ways to interact with every element of the level, and every element of the level can take you to a different place. This means that you can do 10 different playthroughs of this level, and go 10 different ways each time. And the crazy thing is, this is the design philosophy that follows every single level in this game. I don't have time in this video to do a breakdown of every single level, although I'm sure somebody else out there will, but I use this level as a perfect example of what makes this level design so great. Every level is constantly introducing new mechanics, throwing you between interesting set pieces, and offering alternate routes to players who have mastered the mechanics at play. Every single stage in this game has a mechanic that makes it unique from the other ones, and this means that I could imagine any level in this game being someone's favorite. And I didn't even touch on Kingdom Valley Act 2, which expands on a lot of these ideas, and also allows further exploration of the indoor areas of the castle, which we never even got to see in Sonic 06. The only major complaint I have about the levels in this game is that most of them have Radical Highway in them. It is really cool in Space Colony Arc. It's the first time you see it, you maybe weren't expecting it, and it's a really cool set piece for Black Doom to be reintroduced and to see what he's capable of. I do understand the thematic reasons for it being there and why it is kinda cool for the story, and I do appreciate it to that extent, but I also just can't really get behind having to interrupt the levels to get more Radical Highway. I would much rather have had another 2 minutes of Rail Canyon and Sunset Heights than more sections of Radical Highway, especially when there's already a full Radical Highway level. Again, I do understand that there is a good reason for it to be there, Black Doom was trying to bring out the anger that existed within Shadow on that night, but I think there could have been better ways to do it. Maybe instead of just being Radical Highway, it could have been broken up into other levels that would be representative of Shadow's past. Like maybe, I don't know, a Shadow the Hedgehog level from the Shadow the Hedgehog video game that's not represented at all. Okay, I know, it's a lower budget game, there's probably a good reason that was only Radical Highway. I doubt they would have had the budget to add even more levels here, especially just for 2-minute sections to make those entirely new assets, but come on, it really is a disappointment there's no Shadow the Hedgehog level. If we're gonna look at the positives of it though, I do really enjoy that for maybe the first time, the gameplay is actually representative of what's happening in the story. Black Doom is bringing him to these places because he's trying to bring out the anger within Shadow from his past. That's the reason he pulled Maria and Gerald Robotnik into the white space, to make Shadow confront that. And that's the same reason for the boss choices in this game. It's to force Shadow to confront these demons of his past that represent aspects of him. The first boss is the prototype of Shadow the Hedgehog, the Biolizard. The second boss, Metal Overlord, took Shadow's data and copied his power, and Mephiles straight up took Shadow's form and acted as a literal demon for him in Sonic 06. I actually think all these boss fights are really fun, probably a cut above the average Sonic boss. Every one of them has a couple of really cool cinematics that play along with them, or interesting ways to cut the battle short if you're skilled and know how to use Chaos Control well. They're definitely still far from the highlight of the game, but I think they're pretty fun, and I can imagine a first-time player getting really excited at some of the cool stuff that happens in these fights. I also want to take a second just to talk about how cool the build-up to Mephiles is. He's trapped in this weird underground vault, and I remember on my first playthrough specifically, I jumped into the pit that's right at the start of the game, and I wondered, what is sealed away down here? And I spent the whole game thinking what could be down there. You don't get to go down there until almost the very end of the game, where it's all covered in sludge and weird, and it's this completely trapped away underground part of the world. It feels sealed and ancient and decrepit. Then in this boss fight, which is real time Mephiles, he's screaming to Shadow that he wants to exist and to be brought back into the timeline. I think this is really cool storytelling, how the game around it shows that he is literally sealed away in this weird underground branch outside the timeline, and he just will never have the chance to exist. It's a really cool nod to the end of Sonic 06, and it's really great visual storytelling. It's really cool. So I'm going to issue a spoiler warning here before we talk about the final boss. It's the only one that was not revealed in the game's marketing, and I think it's a really, really great finale, so skip to the timestamp below if you don't want to be spoiled on that. So I think this might be the best final boss in the Sonic series. Now, I do know that's a pretty lofty statement, but I really stand by it after thinking about it for a while. I do think Dark Gaia still has a beat on Spectacle, but when it comes to spectacle and gameplay, I think it stands a cut above the rest. Now, the first phase of the boss fight isn't anything too special, it's pretty much a copy and paste of the Metal Overlord boss fight. But on the bright side, that is a really fun boss fight, so at least it's not bad. The second section after that is a Doom Morph section in which you're doing platforming to reach him in order to hit him. I think any platformer that incorporates platforming sections into its boss fights is always great. It acts really well as a final test of skill and a final encounter before it gets ramped up to that final phase. The fight really gets started after this moment, when Shadow enters what I guess is going to be called his evolved state with his wings, and Black Doom is retitled to Neo Black Doom. A sick remix of All Hail Shadow starts playing as he takes to the sky and enters what is pretty much just a supersonic boss fight, but I think this one is really good. This fight is somewhat similar to the Wyvern fight from Sonic Frontiers, which actually was my favorite fight from that game. This one, though, is actually a bit more engaging. You chase down Black Doom as you avoid a bunch of attacks so you can get close enough to get hits in. It's nothing crazy, but I do think it's mechanically very solid, and the spectacle and the great music always keeps you engaged with it. I think that it sits at a really strong middle ground between spectacle and gameplay. If the next Sonic game can build off what we have here, it will absolutely be the best final boss in the series. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that they nailed an explosive finale with this game after Sonic Frontiers though. This game does carry a lot of the DNA of Frontiers. I mean, it was built in the same style, it has the second ever open zone in a Sonic game, and it's built off the same controls. I was really nervous in the build up to this game that it would carry over a lot of the faults that Sonic Frontiers controls have. Sonic Frontiers feels great in the open zone sections, but the in-level controls to me are just way too stiff, and Sonic doesn't even feel fast at his fastest in those levels. Luckily though, this game is able to build on Sonic Frontiers in a way that fixes most of those problems. I think this is the best controlling game since the original Sonic generations. It strikes a really strong balance between tight controls and high speed. The controls are way tighter in this game than the controls that were in Sonic Generations, but they're much faster and more fluid than the controls that were featured in Sonic Frontiers. Unfortunately though, some jank from Sonic Frontiers did get carried over, like the awkward wall jump. In games prior to Sonic Forces, Sonic's wall jump had a dash animation that would smoothly connect him to the walls, but in the newer games you kinda just awkwardly magnetize to the wall and then jump between them in your falling animation. It feels almost like it was a mechanic that was hacked into the game by fans, and it feels really clunky. The lack of the short hop here also can feel really noticeable at times. There are some sections of the game that have small obstacles which would be perfect to short hop over, but there just isn't a short hop, which means you have to lose some speed to cross them, and it can really harm the pace of some levels. I think this is particularly noticeable in the section in Sunset Heights just before the underground moment. There's a long stretch of land on a bridge before that section where you have to hop over small spikes, but there's no short hop, so you kind of awkwardly jump over them and lose some speed, and it just doesn't feel good. Other than those two noticeable gripes, I do think this game has pretty great controls. Something new to this game is Shadow's sidestep, which can be held down to continue sliding left or right. This move feels great to pull off. It allows for incredibly precise positioning of Shadow, and using it to slide back and forth to hit enemies on the path is really fun. Shadow also has a unique homing attack in this game, using the Chaos Snap. Mostly it is just a way to give Shadow a unique animation, but occasionally it can be used to have Shadow snap through walls or obstacles. Another returning ability from 06 would be Shadow's Chaos Spear. Mostly this is just used to stun enemies, to break their defenses, to hit switches, or for certain parts in boss fights. But the really interesting thing is that it's been found that throwing the spears allows you to maintain your momentum. This means that by spamming the Chaos Spear, you're able to make much farther jumps than you otherwise could. I know it's unintentional, but this mechanic is so fun to mess around with, and if you haven't tried it yet, I implore you to. Using it to skip entire sections, or to maintain your momentum over jumps, or Even to do huge skips, like jumping over the castles in Kingdom Valley, is just incredibly satisfying to pull off. By the way, you should definitely switch around the button mapping for Chaos Control and Chaos Spear on your controller. Not only does it make doing this trick much easier, it also just feels better for normal gameplay. Unless you're on console, of course, in which case, you're screwed, sorry. Oh, anyway, Shadow's final new unique ability is Chaos Control, obviously his most iconic one. In this game, Chaos Control acts as a meter, which is at the bottom of the screen, which can be filled up by killing 5 enemies or grabbing a Chaos Control capsule. Using it will stop time for 5 seconds, which actually has a lot more interesting use cases than you'd first expect. There is pretty simple stuff like using it to stop moving platforms, but if you experiment with it, you can use it in a lot of different ways. In Rail Canyon, for example, it can be used to allow access to rails before they're destroyed, giving access to higher paths. Chaos Control also fills your boost meter when used, and enemies killed in Chaos Control will still refill it once the time runs out. This creates an interesting dynamic when pathing levels, as you'll want to find ways to keep time frozen for as long as possible since the game timer freezes too. This makes routing the game completely unique to any other Sonic game, and has made competing in the online leaderboards really intense. This mechanic, alongside the already great level design and controls, makes running this game really interesting, and it's actually sparked my interest in trying to speedrun for the first time. After all, at time of recording, you are listening to the 5th fastest Rail Canyon player and the 7th fastest Space Colony Arc 2 player in the world. With Doomwings on, I should specify, since it is 2 different leaderboards. I bring this up a little bit to flex, but also more importantly, because this game is so good that it has sparked in my heart for the first time an interest in actually climbing these online leaderboards. Prior to this game, I'd never really cared about getting great times in these games outside of just always taking the higher paths. My one big gripe about the leaderboards would be that I wish there were separate leaderboards for real time and in-game time. Because Chaos Control freezes the in-game timer, it incentivizes players to always be in Chaos Control when trying to get good times. This means routing around killing enemies as much as possible, which unfortunately means de-incentivizing the use of higher routes. I do think this aspect of running the game is really interesting, and I enjoy it a lot. It makes it very unique and really fun as well. But I wish there was a category that would allow for more typical Sonic gameplay and more use of movement and high paths over prioritizing Chaos Control at all times. I think both of these should be able to coexist. Really though, I am just happy to have a game with levels so good that it makes me want to go back and play them over and over again and try to climb these leaderboards. Well anyway, now that all that boring game stuff's been talked about, we can finally get to what everyone's really playing this children's hedgehog game for, the deep story. So jokes aside, going into this game, I was expecting something a bit more story heavy. And while there isn't actually much time in the game to explore what is here, what they do with what they have is, I think, really good. Right off the bat, the story's presentation is incredible, an absolutely huge step up from basically every other Sonic game. Every scene is clearly framed with intention, it's all super well animated and just gorgeous all around. There are some really jaw-dropping shots in this game, both from the story scenes and the in-level cinematics. If the games can maintain this level of animation quality moving forward, we are definitely in good hands. The story itself is maybe a little bit predictable, but its execution is really great. This game works perfectly as a reintroduction of the character of Shadow into this series. It follows as Black Doom tries to tempt Shadow to give in to his anger and hatred, so that Black Doom may take over his body and use him as a vessel to conquer the world. To prey on Shadow's misery, he somehow is able to pull Gerald and Maria into the white space, and repeatedly brings Shadow into places from his past in an effort to tear him down. Black Doom gives Shadow powers over the game, and builds him into this perfect weapon to utilize, only for it all to fall apart when Shadow's anger is able to be put to rest by Maria. Really, the story here is about Shadow being confronted again by a past he has struggled to throw away, and in confronting it one last time, he is able to finally start to heal from it and move forward. It is a bit of a retread of some of the ideas from Shadow the Hedgehog, but they have thrown in a little extra dialogue from Gerald and Rouge to show that Shadow has come a long way and make sure that Shadow's character growth isn't just forgotten about. My little summary here obviously isn't doing it justice, but what we have here is a really strong story about Shadow coming, literally, face to face with his past one more time, truly making peace with it, and moving forward as a new man, following his own ambitions and keeping Maria dear to his heart. And I'll admit, the end of the story got to me a little bit. It pulled on the heartstrings, which a Sonic game has not done for me before. This is one of my favorite Sonic stories. Next time though, they should actually include Omega. He's my favorite. But really, I was pleasantly surprised by this game's writing and the characterization and the performances. Kirk Thornton really steps into the role of Shadow for this game and delivers a great performance. Previously, I'd never been a fan of his work as Shadow, but he has proven himself here. He's probably now my favorite voice actor in the modern cast. We see in this game Shadow as an actual character for the first time in ages, and Kirk's great performance has a lot to do with that, and I'm very thankful. There are also some really nice character moments if you take the time to talk to the characters between stages. Stuff like Omega commenting on his relief to finally know that Rouge is safe, or his comfort in being with Shadow and Rouge, or Rouge teasing Shadow for being worried about her. Every character here is written better than we have seen in years. I particularly found that Gerald's regret and angst over Shadow, and Shadow's more heroic attitude in Maria's present to be really nice to see. Gerald seems to realize pretty early on that Shadow does not come from his time and probably comes from a time after his own death. And he tries to make sure that Shadow knows that he's proud of him and he wants him to be his own man. The characters in this game feel more in character than they have in well over a decade, and it feels really good to have them back. And in a game full of pleasant surprises, the most surprising to me, by far, was the way Sonic is written. In Shadow's story, Sonic shows up, beats Shadow's ass, says "see you later," and disappears for the rest of the story.
Nice hustle, but I won this one. So I'm taking the emerald. See ya!
Sure, the beginning of their interaction has some of those quirks about Ian Flynn's writing, like the very overt references to past lines, which I'm not a big fan of, but I can look past it here because Sonic does something that he has not done in like 15 years. He acts like Sonic. He's snarky, confident, kind of an asshat. He shows up with a mission, accomplishes it, and then disappears. He's quick, to the point, cocky, and doesn't stick around too long. I can easily imagine these lines coming from any of the other Sonic voice actors. They just feel so in character and so refreshing after we've kind of struggled to see Sonic act like himself for so long. Even though Roger Craig Smith is not my favorite Sonic, he is definitely a fantastic voice actor in his own right, and here I actually quite enjoy his performance. If this is a sign for how we can expect to see Sonic from here on, things are looking great. Well, speaking of Sonic, I guess I should briefly talk about the Sonic part of Sonic X Shadow Generations, shouldn't I? There's not much to say about it, honestly, but I think there's just a little bit worth mentioning. There is a small graphical update, nothing crazy, but I think it looks a little bit nicer. The biggest change is the addition of the drop dash. For modern Sonic, it could have been neat, but even with the modern control scheme, you have to homing attack before you can use it, and it's worse than the boost, so it's useless, pretty much, although it is harmless. For classic Sonic, though, I think it's a pretty fun addition. They added it as a skill, so you can completely remove it if you don't like it, and it gives drawbacks to it, so it's not just a free upgrade since it costs skill points. For classic Sonic, I think this is a good addition. Then there are the Chow, which don't really add anything except for something to collect. You don't get anything for collecting them either, so my honest recommendation is not to bother unless you just really want extra content. They do look pretty cute though, following Sonic around and hanging out in the hub world, making it look more alive. Other than that, the only big change is the new script, and I'm gonna be completely honest, I do not care. The original game already barely had a story, and it still doesn't. The rewrite does not change that this is a complete nothing burger of a game. If you do want a video talking in depth about the story changes, you should check out the video that Splash Dash made about it. I think that's a pretty great video, and I do agree with everything he said in that video. I just can't really be bothered to talk about it here. It's not important, I think, to the main game. Nobody's playing Generations for the story. You're playing it because that game is a great game. And that's honestly my biggest takeaway from having replayed Sonic Generations for this video. It's just still great. Even though I only played it like a month ago, I had a great time playing it start to finish again. I had no complaints about it other than Planet Wisp, which, sucks. But, it's good. It holds up. It's so replayable. And you know what? In playing the game for this video, I even found a brand new path I'd never seen before in Ocean Palace. You know how crazy that is, that I'm still finding new paths? It's useless, and I honestly don't even know how you'd find yourself there in a regular playthrough of the level. Like, I'm puzzled by it. But it's cool that it's here, it looks pretty cool. But yeah, it's just Sonic Generations. Nothing really to say about it, it's still good. And I think that might make Sonic X Shadow Generations the best Sonic game. It's kind of cheating because it's a remaster of what already might have been the best Sonic game, and then another new Sonic game that's also great on top of it, but, you know, that still counts. So I mean, if you haven't gotten the game yet, I highly recommend it, especially if you haven't played Sonic Generations before. I was unsure that this was the right direction to go with the series after Frontiers, but now, I'm sold. A game with this level of quality, a game this good with original themes, a bigger, more expansive hub world, but with the quality of the Shadow hub world, it would definitely be the best Sonic game, or at least in competition for it. Over the course of this video, I kept thinking, if things can keep going on this track, if things can continue this way, if they can keep this up, I'll be happy. And that really is the thesis of my feelings on this game as a whole. If we can keep getting games this good, then this series does have a bright future. It really does just get about everything right. It's a fantastic game, packaged with an older, also fantastic game. You know, it just feels so great to be able to say that I am finally completely back on board with this series. And I am so excited for the first time since I was a kid to see where Sonic can take us from here. Hey, thank you so much for listening, guys. I really appreciate anyone who stayed to watch my silly video, especially all the way to the end. I've got a couple more ideas for videos in my mind. I might do one more Sonic video before I talk about something different. I don't want to just make Sonic videos. I do have other interests, believe it or not, but for the next one I think I might talk about Rollin' Rascal and Sonic GT at once. So if anyone has a game in mind that they'd like to see talked about, please feel free to comment below. I honestly love to see comments and discussion. I try to read everything I can. So one more time, just thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. So Metal Overlord totally sounds like Bowser, right?